Hello, welcome to our new panel today on Moscow to Riyadh to Washington and the oil crisis. This is really a panel to discuss an unprecedented turn of events in the economic field, the oil price field, and the politics of the Middle East. One of our panelists, Dr. David Rundell, has coined the new phrase. This is Yalta 2, but instead of the British, the Americans and the Russians getting together to divide up the world, it seems to be the Russians, the Americans, and the Saudis who at least divide up that part of the world. I won't take much more time other than to introduce Dr. Brenda Shaffer, who will be our moderator. She is currently the Atlantic Council's at the Atlantic Council Global Energy Center, visiting research and an adjunct professor at my alma mater, Georgetown University, which raises her even higher in my estimation. So, Brenda?
Thank you. Good morning. Well, I think that Gulf International Forum was very insightful in choosing today for this event. Today we've had sort of a mini spike in the oil price. I think that adds a lot, something that will add to our discussion. We've had both WTI and Brent up today, based on U.S. inventories actually having grown lower than expected. Something we will discuss today, and also with lockdowns. Restrictions being eased in many places, especially in Asia. In Europe, there's expectations for an uptick in mobility, uptick in economic activity, which would mean also an uptick in demand for oil. So essentially, though, we don't, any of our existing economic theory or theory about how the oil market acts doesn't give us much of a roadmap for what's going to happen post lockdowns. We really, except for maybe for a short period after the September 11th attacks, we really don't have obstruction of economic activity on its own, but simply because we stopped, our mobility, our economic activity. So really, we're going to have a very volatile year ahead, and I'm really glad to have these excellent panelists to help explain what's going to happen. With here, please, prepare your questions. We really want to hear from you in the second part of our session. So, panelists. Maybe we'll start with you, David. We've had this decision, unprecedented high production. Saudi Arabia made a decision to increase production. How much did this supply overhang contribute to the current crash in global oil prices? Was this meaningful, or was this crash inevitable in light of the COVID-19 restrictions? Maybe we'll start with you, David.
Okay. Well, in the beginning of March, there was an oversupply in the global market of several million barrels, perhaps as much as 3 million barrels a day. And this was leading to I guess that's my screen has changed a bit. So, and this was leading to a fall in prices. The Saudis and the Russians had, and the rest of OPEC, but really the Saudis and the Russians, and something that was referred to as OPEC Plus, had negotiated an agreement, which was, again, an interesting, and I don't like to use the word historic, but it was sort of an historic to our major exporter, and the Saudis, who are the other major exporter, had come to an agreement as to what they thought production should be. With the overhang that existed in early March, which had begun to be influenced by COVID, the Saudis thought that the production cuts should be increased. And they had a meeting with the OPEC Plus group in which they suggested, okay, this is important to understand, that it was the Russians who rejected the Saudi request for additional increases. Now, the Russians did not walk away from the table. They did not reject the idea of continuing the existing production levels, but they didn't want to make more cuts. The Saudis felt that that was necessary, that they were not, and they were not going to do it alone. This is, again, very important to understand that the Saudis' oil policy has changed over time. There have been periods of time when they were more interested in price. There have been other times when they were more interested in market share. But essentially, since the mid-'80s, they have been unwilling to, if you will, carry the can for everybody else. During the 80s, the mid-'80s, they dramatically cut their production in order to keep prices up, only to watch everybody else cheat. And they concluded that they would never do that again. And so that's really what the situation was at the beginning of March, when the Russians said, we're not going to cut. The Saudis said, we're not going to cut for you and carry the can for everybody else, particularly the, and this isn't, we'll get to this in a minute, but it also deals with the American shale producers who the Russians and to some extent the Saudis did view as free riders, which in fact they were. So any event, to answer your question, that neither the Saudis nor the Russians, I think, expected what was going to come in the later part of March, when you saw what was a supply overhang turn into a demand collapse. And so, as I said, what they did in early March might have been reasonable. What later happened was not so much as a result of the collapse you're talking about is not the result of their agreement or lack of agreement in early March. It's a result of the lockdown of, I've read now that as many as 4 billion people on the planet have been locked down. So that's really what created this situation. The suppression of the economy, if you will. Some people have used the phrase suppression. It's not a recession. It's not a depression. It's a suppression of the economy done basically by governments. So I hope that answered your question.
Sure. So bottom line, if I understand your point, is that yes, there was a supply overhang, but this market crash would have been inevitable due to the demand destruction.
Yes, absolutely. I should have been this much quicker and said that. Yes, the Saudis produce. They don't export all of it, but they produce 10 million barrels a day. The overhang, the supply collapse was over 20 million. Some people say 25 million barrels a day. So
maybe
the Saudis,
30, yeah.
Yeah, some say 30. So the Saudis could completely shut in all their wells tomorrow, and you'd still have far more oversupply than you did in the beginning of March.
Thank you. Michael.
I agree with everything David has said. I would just add that when I was in Riyadh in January, Saudi observers I talked to were already expecting a considerable decline in demand for oil from China. They're already talking about a bad year for oil prices. And that was behind their thinking about the need for another round of production cuts. In Russia, you have a different situation in which structurally it's more difficult because of Russia's oil geology for people to cut back without damaging the fields. Putin has always been facing a lot of pressure from Rosneft, Lukoil, etc., to maintain an increased production. And Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, has always felt that the production restraint agreement that Saudi has struck with the Russians is actually working to the benefit of the American fracking industry more than anybody else. And there's always been pressure on Putin to back away from their agreement with Riyadh. As David pointed out very accurately, the Russians back in March simply proposed continuing the current levels of production. They didn't want additional cuts. They did, however, decide to pump all out in response to the Saudis' decision to increase production. And there was a strong school of thinking in the Russian oil industry that this is a way to damage the U.S. fracking sector by driving prices down while trying to grab back some market share that the Russians felt they'd lost in recent years.
Thank you. Michael, I'm going to ask you to answer this question first. So what does this mean for the U.S. shale? I mean, obviously, as the most of the major production, the most expensive production, and also not having the government backing in terms of funding and structure of funding. What do you see over the year and maybe over the next 3 to 5 years? What does this mean for the U.S. shale industry? We'll start with Michael.
Okay, I'll be brief because David has a much deeper knowledge of U.S. shale than I do. He's actually a player in that space. But to me, as an observer, not a player, what U.S. shale really has going for it is a tremendous ability to engaged in technical innovation. Every time oil market experts say that U.S. shale will never be able to produce profitably at a price X, somebody figures out a more efficient way to produce. This is a huge advantage that we have over the Russians and the Saudis. The Russians do quite a bit of hydraulic fracturing, and they're very good at horizontal drilling. But the structure of the oil industry involves so much state control that they're just not as agile or creative as we are. So I think we're going to go through a rough patch in the U.S. oil industry probably for the next several years because there's been so much demand destruction globally. But I see the U.S. shale industry bouncing back after another round of technical innovation. And now I'll pass it over to David.
David?
Yeah, I guess in what they call full disclosure, that's true. I do produce oil and gas in the Permian Basin of West Texas, and I've done so for 35 years. So I'm actively involved in this. There's a reason why the shale revolution began basically in Midland, Texas, and why it was done by medium-sized independent producers. It wasn't created by ExxonMobil, and it certainly wasn't created in China or Russia. It was the result of small and medium-sized independents using new technologies, and really, in fact, really using old technologies in new ways is what it really boiled down to. It's as if you want, someday we can explain exactly what this fracking is all about. It's kind of interesting, and a lot of people don't really understand what's going on or what it really is. But fracking itself is not new. Fracking's been going on for a long time. What was new is fracking of shale. Previously, people had fracked sandstone and limestone, the reservoir rocks. What was new was fracking shale. And that began as the fracking for gas initially, and then it developed and so that you could actually frack for oil. So the point is, this is all based on innovation, creativity, risk-taking, and innovation, which America is unrivaled in the world. Again, I'll just give you a small insight into why that is the case. I live in England as well part of the year, and people ask me, well, should we do this fracking? And there's a strong opposition to fracking in Britain. And there are some places where you could do it. And I say to my English friends, no way, I wouldn't allow fracking in England. And they say, yeah, but you do that in Texas. Why don't you want it here? And I said, yeah, because in Texas, thanks to Thomas Jefferson, I own the mineral rights under my house and in the land that I lease or buy. In Britain, you don't own the mineral rights. They belong to the crown. So somebody drills an oil well in your backyard and all the money goes to the government. Why would you want to do that? I mean, it's inconvenient to have a big truck and an oil rig in your backyard. So if you're not going to get paid, why would you want to do that? So basically, that's just one small example of how the American, other than Canada and the United States, you don't own the mineral rights to your own property anywhere in the world. So that's just a small example. But what I really want to emphasize is that in 2014, everybody was telling us that the frackers are going to go out of business because they need $60 a barrel. Then they said, oh, the frackers need $30 a barrel. There are people making money at, they say they need 40 some now. There are people making money at 23, 24. Again, I don't want to go into too much detail really and bore you, but in the same way that people tell you the Saudi budget only will balance at $80 a barrel, that's a somewhat misleading figure. I wrote about that the other day. It's also true when people say the frackers need $40 a barrel or $30 a barrel. It very much depends on who you are and the quality of the rock. So
if I understand, bottom line from both of you is that the U.S. Shale industry will be around and will sustain this current crisis.
I'm sorry, I took too long, but yes, that's absolutely. And it's already happening. The price at which people can make money in the Permian. Look, I'll be very quick. The industry will consolidate and it will come out of this stronger. There are people who will go out of business. These are mostly people who have heavy debt loads. Okay. So if you borrowed money to drill your wells and you now can't pay your debt, you probably will have a real problem. but stronger players will buy those people, and the economy, the business will continue.
I think that's an important point. If we look at 2014, we didn't see the collapse of an industry. We saw consolidation. And like you said, that can sometimes lead actually to a stronger industry in the long run. So can I ask you guys?
We saw consolidation. We saw people, as David just pointed out, get to the point where they could produce profitably at a much lower price. We're going to see that again. And we're going to continue to outcompete the Russians and the Saudis in terms of the prices at which we can profitably produce, fracked oil and gas.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a hard question, because it's, it's always this way with the oil price, because we can check it. It's not something like, when will there be peace somewhere, or, something that you could take over time. I'm going to ask you actually a specific question on time and the oil price. And we're going to, hopefully the Gulf International Forum will reconvene us in the fall, and we'll check your answers. So where do you see the global oil market in the fall, but both WTI and Brent? Is some kind of band, if you can give us, and what are those benchmarks that need to pass to happen for the trend that you perceive happening to take place? For instance, would it be deployment of a vaccine, deployment of a treatment for COVID-19? Is it just policy changes for the trend that you see emerging in the oil price? What are the steps or the benchmarks, other types of benchmarks that have to take place for this trend to happen?
I'll just say very quickly, because the oil price is made up of many, many factors that, and we do have a pretty good oil price.
Okay, but we want a specific guess.
Yeah, I'll give you a guess.
Mike.
Okay, I'm going to say that I believe that prices will fluctuate in a band between $20 and $35 a barrel, if we're at either end of the scale for West Texas Intermediate. And I'm saying that right now because I think that the key factor this year is the speed at which we unlock the U.S. economy and other major capitalist economies around the globe. Right now, I see our economies unlocking themselves slowly rather than quickly. And I believe that, unfortunately, we're going to see a large number of bankruptcies in this economy, particularly in the services sector. The recovery will be slow, therefore, and oil demand will recover relatively slowly. So I don't really see a surge in prices this year, and I think the key to getting back to normal economic activity will be the development of both a vaccine and a cure. You need both, really, to regenerate the public confidence necessary for economic activity to get back to where it was before. I think scientific progress toward both of those things is going to be more rapid than people expect. As Ambassador Theros mentioned a little bit earlier, there's been unprecedented cooperation between research centers in this country. I think we were talking about that before the session began. And it's in addition, there's been a loosening of the usual government bureaucracy and rulemaking in terms of healthcare products and services. So I see both a vaccine and an actual treatment, a therapeutic treatment, what some might call a cure, probably hitting the market in the next 12 to 18 months. And that's when you begin to see real recoveries back toward normal levels of oil demand, in my opinion.
David, where are we going to be in the fall and what needs to happen?
I don't know about the fall. I mean, look, I'm a little more optimistic than Michael. I think I agree with Michael. Look, there's a chain of events here. So basically, you have to deal with the COVID, which then once you figured that out, then you get the economy moving. And then finally, the third step is the oil prices rising. So really, this is a question of what do you think is going to happen with COVID, and what do you think then that will lead to the economy? I'm a little more optimistic. I think that the number I'm using for my own self is about $40 to $45 by the end of the year. I think it's too early to talk about the fall. So come see me in January 1st. And I think you'll have oil in the 40s by then.
Okay, thank you. So our panelists are saying oil somewhere in the band between 30 and 40 in the fall. So what will that mean for economic recovery of the United States and globally? Essentially, we would have pretty moderate oil prices. Will this actually fuel economic growth? How do you see that price interacting with the economic recovery? Maybe we'll start with Michael.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, as David has often pointed out to me, lower oil prices are like a tax cut. So low to moderate oil prices are going to be good for the recovery of every sector but oil production. Prices strengthening from where they are now, and just last week they were in negative territory. If they do actually hit $40 by the end of the year, as David is suggesting, for Brent or WTI or both, then obviously that's going to be good for the recovery of the industry. So yeah, I'd say that David and I are both optimists when it comes to recovery and toward the ability of our medical establishment to deal with the COVID-19 threat. I'm a little bit less optimistic than he, but we see the same trends at work.
Thank you, David.
Yeah, I mean, sure. The question is fundamentally different between the United States and the other two countries we're talking about today. In the United States, oil is a sector. In Saudi Arabia, and to some extent Russia, which Mike knows more about than I do, but in Saudi Arabia, it's an existential issue. I mean, the oil. So the whole economy depends on the price of oil. So they have a totally different scenario than the United States. In the United States, low oil prices helps the economy. There's no doubt about that. The problem is that at the moment, it's an unusual situation. So obviously, if gasoline prices are low, that helps everybody who moves by motor transport. However, if nobody's moving by motor transport, and the reason that the oil prices are low is because everybody's keeping their car in the garage, that doesn't really help you that much. So at the moment, it's not helping. I think as the economy begins to pick up, low oil prices will certainly help most of the economy, and it's a cyclical industry. I mean, people in West Texas, they're I wouldn't say they like it, but they're certainly not surprised that people gain jobs, lose jobs, gain jobs. It happens. So but that's a somewhat isolated part of the American economy. So by and large, it's a good thing. Low oil prices will fuel economic growth. Across the board.
I would only add that it's inevitable that the economy will reopen, right? I think it's going to happen more slowly than should be the case, but as political pressure at the local and state level to reopen and to gradually reduce the lockdown measures grows, and it's clearly growing, there are more and more demonstrations all the way from California to New York every day, basically. A reopening is inevitable, and it will occur. Probably a bit too slowly, but it'll happen.
I think it's important takeaways from your recent statements. One, that low oil prices, while it might be perceived now as a crash, as a crisis for the United States, intervention of the president in the oil market because it's perceived as a danger to the industry, but actually overall for the U.S. economy, as we return to mobility and return to work, these lower oil prices will actually fuel this recovery. I think it's an important takeaway. And I think also for many observers, especially people from outside the oil world, it's very important to remember that the oil cycle. So anyone who's lived through as an observer, in the industry, you've lived through 1, 2, you learn this and you learn to prepare for it. And I think that too often many observers assume whatever's happening now is what's going to happen next, meaning that if we're having now low oil prices, that's it. This is the era of low oil prices. Any of us who've lived through a number of cycles know that nothing cures low oil prices like low oil prices, and that we're generally setting the stage for the next spike, and the opposite, the spikes are setting the stage for the next crash. So
I think that's very important, what you just said. That's very important. People, that needs to be amplified. What you just said is that it's a statement that the solution for low oil prices is lower oil prices. And so what we're doing now, and you're absolutely right, you're going to see now a slowdown We're seeing cancellation of projects all over the place. Okay, so there's going to be a demand or a supply shortage in a few years because it takes many years to drill these oil wells and bring these production facilities online. And now everything's being canceled. So a few years from now, things that would have been built will not be built, and there will be a supply shortage. So the price will go back up. That's exactly what you just said.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. Yeah.
I mean, I've seen oil in Midland, Texas at $10 a barrel, and I've seen it at $145 a barrel, and that's just in my lifetime. Gas prices are, which I think you're going to talk about that later. Natural gas prices, I've seen those at $18 a barrel, and now they're $1.80. That's a tenfold change. And the $18 price was about 2003. So these things are hugely volatile, far more volatile than, the price of your house or the price of a car.
Right.
Most
and the same,
else
it goes,
anyway.
one of you made the point before about, the balancing the budget, $90, right? So any country who's lived through what it's almost like a baptism. You have to go through it once in order to be in the club, right? Any country that's been through it once, so you had mid 1980s oil crisis. Since then, the Gulf countries have learned how to deal with these cycles and build their budgets and their sovereign wealth funds. Russia in '99 going through the crisis, and then it did very well in the 2014 crisis. Some of the smaller producers like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, that had their first major hit in 2014, probably will be better, prepared for this round than they were in 2014. So,
well, I can just say a word about the Russians. The Russians are extremely well prepared at this point,
right.
with $560 billion in reserves, of which $120 billion is in gold. I mean, they're extremely conservative fiscal policy. They're not actually shutting wells at this point. They're simply moving into a repair and maintenance phase so they can increase pumping capacity when prices recover. So, yeah, they're going to get through this okay. I've seen a few articles in the press recently about supposed political instability and economic instability coming to Russia because of recent oil price trends. I wouldn't believe it. I don't believe it. The Russians will take a hit to the federal budget, but they'll simply draw down their reserves and borrow, exactly as the Saudis will do.
Yeah, that's an important point as well, in that we all studied economics as undergraduates, and we all heard about, the counter-cyclical management of your economy. It's something that the Saudis and the Russians actually take seriously and do it. When they're making money, and the prices are high, they build up their reserves. They don't continue to have deficit spending even when times are good. We are, in theory, should be doing the same, but we seem to always run a deficit no matter what happens. But they actually put their budget in surplus when they have a chance to, and both Saudi Arabia and Russia built up substantial reserves, which are a big cushion for them when times get hard.
The Russians at this point can be called some of the best Keynesians on the planet. I mean, they have an extremely conservative fiscal policy, massive foreign reserves, almost no foreign debt. So they're very well positioned to do counter-cyclical management, as David mentioned, and that's what's going to happen.
So, David, you mentioned some of the new projects won't receive the FID this year. New projects won't be launched, and so therefore, when our economic activity increases, the oil won't be there, and setting the stage potentially for a spike. But there's also an additional element that's happening more this time than in previous price cycles, which is the actual sort of physical destruction, shut-ins of wells, filling up, lack of operation of pipelines, shutting down of fields, which, as you know quite well, this is not an industry that you just turn the button on and off or open the faucet or close the faucet. It creates real damage, to these facilities, to this infrastructure when you have these shut-ins. And there's also the fiscal side where even if you can rev it up, you need money to do that. It just turning it on also costs money. So how do you see with the shut-ins and the bankruptcies, but even more emphasis on the shut-ins, together with the lack of new production decisions? I'll start with David. How is that going to affect the overall trend of the oil price? So talk to David and then come to Michael.
Hi. Okay. Oil wells and oil fields are complicated geological and technological institutions, whatever. But they don't all function the same way. So some of them can be turned on and turned off much more easily than others. Fortunately, and this, without getting too technical, depends to a big extent on the kind of pressure and drive that you have in the wells. Fracked shale wells use what's called solution gas drive mostly, and that is something you can turn on and off. You can shut in the well more easily without losing the pressure. Other kinds of wells, older wells with low production, which are called stripper wells, wells in the Arctic, the Canadian tar sands, wells that use steam flood or water flood. These kinds of wells and fields are much more sensitive to being shut in. So provided that you shut in wells in an intelligent way and you do it in a studied fashion, you should be able to bring back most of what you shut in. And if it comes to some sort of a collapse where everybody has to turn everything off tomorrow, that would be a real problem. But I don't really see that happening. I think people are going to shut in wells in an intelligent way. For the first time really in my history, we've started shutting in wells, but we're doing it with the intelligent, with the consulting with lots of geologists and reservoir engineers to make sure that we're doing it so we can bring it back on. So I don't think that you're going to lose a lot of production in the United States. I think I don't think you're going to lose a lot of potential. You know, it's funny. You can also lose. It's funny to mention it, really, but you can also lose damage a field by producing it too fast. Mm-hmm. That's something the Iranians have done. But in any event, that's another story. So I don't think we're going to lose a lot of potential production by the way we're shutting in. I think the real concern that you mentioned is that we're not going to drill new wells, and more to the point, we're going to slow down building pipelines or gas exporting facilities or a variety of things that cost a lot of money and take a lot of time. So that, I think, is where you're going to see a shortage of supply in the future. At least not now, because we're going to damage our fields.
It's very nuanced field, very different than we're hearing from most. It's either a package or not. So I think it's very interesting. Michael?
Well, just to speak about Russia, I mean, much of Russia's oil potential is located in places like Khanty-Mansisk Oblast and the Yamal Peninsula, so areas near the Arctic Circle where temperature really makes a difference. It's great for their LNG industry, right? Because when it's already minus 40 degrees outside on the coast of the Arctic Ocean and you're trying to chill natural gas to minus 70, you don't really have to spend that much energy to do it, unlike Qatar in the summer or Saudi Arabia. So, the Russians I think what we'll see the Russians doing is investing more in their LNG industry in coming years. They've been making a big play there. Last year, they exported 24 billion cubic meters of LNG gas to Europe, outcompeting the Norwegians and us. And I think they're going to continue to make a drive in that direction, despite low LNG prices. It's a strategic long-term play for them. In terms of their oil fields, they have to be careful what they actually shut down because of temperature issues. The temperature in the winter goes to minus 70 in eastern Siberia, and I've been through those conditions. It's really rather remarkable. I remember the oil towns I visited had the custom of never turning off their equipment. They ran it throughout the entire winter, because if you actually turned off the equipment, the metal would crystallize and then shatter when you turn the engine back on again. So these are the conditions they have to worry about. Very different from Saudi Arabia, and I would expect that they'll be very careful about actually shutting in wells. What they'll try to do instead is halt production in order to upgrade facilities and then increase productivity when prices return to something like normal.
It's very interesting. I would like, before we move to the next question, I would like to encourage our participants to send questions. After this next question, we're going to open it up to your questions. And so far, we received several very interesting questions. Okay, keep it coming. So to our panelists, I'll give you two questions, and you can pick one of them or both of them. But before we move to the participants' questions, so if you look at the U.S. press and the handling of the COVID-19, you would think that I keep seeing, or also British press as well, European press, you keep seeing headlines, lack of American leadership, a lack of American influence. It's kind of in the vogue right now in the American press. Yet you see an almost unprecedented situation where when Saudi Arabia and Russia and the wider OPEC Plus group needed to come to an agreement, they wanted the U.S. that can't even speak, even with the knowledge knowing that the U.S. can't speak, can't commit for cuts by the U.S. oil industry, but still they wanted the U.S. involved in playing a major role in this agreement. For me, this looked like actually U.S. standing is pretty high in the eyes of several of these powers. So how do you see the U.S. Government role, the role of the administration in shepherding this agreement and maybe future agreements on the market, despite the fact that, legally the U.S. government can't tell producers, when and how much to produce? And also, if you like to hear your view on where you see market share going as we exit this crisis. So will there be a big shift in the market share of the major producers? So David, we want to open it up?
Do I want to open it up? I was going to let Michael take this one. I feel
the hard ones.
I've been
always throw the hard ones to
Why don't you
Michael.
let Michael talk about talk about Trump? Mike, you want to talk about that and the president's role in changing this event?
Well, I mean, I never thought I would live long enough to see the United States emerge into the position it currently occupies on the global energy scene. I mean, this is really amazing, and it's all been due to technological innovation by small and medium-sized producers in the Permian Basin. It's changed the world. So I spent most of my diplomatic career in a world in which the United States was an importer that had to negotiate, stable market conditions and arrangements with producers. At the same time, during most of my career, Russia was exporting oil in order to pay for food. In the last year of its existence, 1988, the Soviet Union imported 32 million metric tons of grain, and they paid for it with oil and gas exports. And that was one of the major tools we could use back in the Cold War days to influence Soviet behavior. Now we're in a new world where Russia, the United States, and Saudi Arabia together account for 30% of global oil production, 30% of the supply side of the market. So it's natural for Moscow and Riyadh to reach out to Washington. I think President Trump handled that particular challenge rather well. We don't have a Ministry of Oil, as you pointed out, so we can't commit to production targets. I had to admire the way he handled it diplomatically. He said, well, as prices come down, obviously U.S. production will decline. Well, of course. So that's really the extent to which we're contributing to restraining production. We're just letting market forces play out. The Russians and the Saudis have a problem because they're not as creative or innovative on the technological side as U.S. frackers are, whether we're talking to major companies or the much more creative smaller companies. We really are the ones who are going to figure out how to make oil fracking and gas fracking productive and profitable at ever lower prices. And so I think for the near to medium term, once we get out of this current crisis and supply returns to normal as the lockdowns are removed, we're going to see the U.S. continue to be the new swing producer. For years, we called Saudi Arabia the central bank of oil in global terms, but now it's the United States. So the Russians and the Saudis really have no alternative but to try to, include us in their discussions. As our technology expands, the range at which we can produce profitably, I would see the Russians and the Saudis continue to lose market share to an expanding U.S. industry. I don't think we've reached the maximum in terms of U.S. production or exports at all. And once we get past the current crisis, and I would say in 2 years' time, we'll see the U.S. industry expand in terms of production and exports again.
So I think there's an important headline here, because basically what Michael is saying is against the grain. Most seeing that actually, the cheaper producers, especially Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, but even Russia will come out, on top of this, and the biggest loser will be the U.S. Production. Michael saying the opposite. So, David, after you've tossed the hard, you've had time to think. Michael took the hard questions.
No, I'll the president clearly did play a role in bringing about this agreement between Russia and Saudi Arabia, and in order to do that, he made some commitments for the United States. What those were exactly, that don't seem to be completely clear. He seems to have made some sort of an arrangement with Mexico in order to get the Mexicans to sign on to this agreement in the end. So, and that seems to have been a sticking point. So, yes, I think it's true that the president was able, and I think what he really was there was more of a marriage broker. I mean, it was clearly in both of these countries' interests to make this agreement, but they had both become somewhat angry spouses, if you will, and having their fight in Vienna, where they were each one sort of annoyed with the other. So I think he was something of a peacemaker between them, and he made some commitments to help get the United to get them to bring the United States into this. As I said earlier, it's usually in the United States' interests to have low oil prices because that's good for our economy. But there have been instances, and particularly in the mid-'80s when George Bush the first went to Riyadh and said, you know, this oil price collapse that you're engineering in the mid-'80s was damaging to the American industry, and that's really what happened now. So there is a tipping point, if you will, where the damage being done to our domestic oil industry outweighs the benefit that we're getting from low oil, and we reached that point somewhere in March, and so the president stepped in and helped to resolve that situation. I think there's another point to be mentioned here is that the U.S. government on a federal level cannot control oil output, but the government of Texas definitely can. There is something called the Texas Railroad Commission. It does have the ability to regulate production. It has done that in the past. And this perhaps is something, if you're not in the industry, you don't know about. But in they call it allocation. The way they do it is not by barrels a day or barrels period. They do it by how many days a week you can produce your well. And there was, in fact, just 2 weeks ago now, 10 days ago, there was a hearing at the Texas Railroad Commission where a number of small independents, really led by a company called Pioneer, asked for the reimposition of quotas. Basically, they wanted Texas to join OPEC. It was an interesting meeting. The major lobbies for the industry, mainly the American Petroleum Institute, strongly opposed this, strongly opposed the reintroduction of quotas, strongly was against the imposition of tariffs. Both of which, and I should say that the president also used those techniques, and that's important to remember as well. You know, this threatening of tariffs, that got the Saudis' attention. And I don't think it was an accident that these senators sent a letter to Saudi Arabia saying, you know, if you keep this up, we're going to cut off your arms sales. I think that they probably coordinated, I don't know this, but I would imagine they coordinated that with the White House. That also put pressure on the Saudis. So he was orchestrating this compromise, and so that was helpful. Anyway, the point I was making is that most of the industry, not all of it, but most of it, opposes the imposition of tariffs and quotas on the United States. Although, as I said, it is possible and could happen.
Right. So how these prices affect the U.S. economy, as you pointed out, that now that the U.S. is the world's top producer of oil and also natural gas, the price trend is a mixed bag for the U.S. economy. So if it used to be that low oil prices were good for the U.S. economy, now it depends where you are in the U.S. economy. So the average family budget, yes, low oil prices are as you said, a tax cut, or they're a growth factor. But since a major portion of the U.S. oil industry sector, if you're in the oil patch, this is negative for you, and any companies that are connected. So I think that we have some great questions that have come in. I think that point of yours, and how that oil prices essentially affect different sectors in the United States different ways. So if you're in Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, you're going to feel differently about low oil prices than if you're just on a one of the big coastal cities. So Agnes brought us the question: how would the COVID-19 and low oil price impact the U.S. Upcoming presidential election? Michael?
Well, actually,
Since David gives you all the hard questions.
we've done some thinking about that, and oddly enough, I guess I ended up there because I spent most of my career in the State Department doing political and economic analysis. So after retiring from the government, I ended up becoming affiliated with an artificial intelligence company that does predictive analytics. And we've used our algorithms, which were not designed by me, I'm no mathematician, but with which I like to work quite a bit to look at this whole issue. And it's quite interesting because the algorithms indicate that the COVID crisis has actually increased significantly the likelihood that the president will be reelected in the fall. Apparently, and it's a complicated thing when you look at it, because one of the things our algorithms do is they look at, they use game theory to look at how various actors in the U.S. political system compete and cooperate with each other. And essentially, to simplify a complicated scenario, the president's handling the crisis so far has boosted his support significantly higher than it would have been. So despite, the absolute wallop that the economy has taken because of the lockdowns, it seems that despite, the fact that we're looking at perhaps 20 or 30% unemployment this year by the end of the year, the likelihood of the president's reelection is greater now than it was before the crisis, because his handling is seen as very, very satisfactory by a majority of the population. And this is now one of the top issues out there, more important in many people's minds than the economy.
David, weigh in and maybe your views from the oil patch.
Well, I would just say that Michael and I, we have a firm that does analytics for the Arabian Gulf, and we have used that model. I just would amplify that. We used these predictive analytics on a number of events already. We did modeling for the Saudis on the gasoline price increases. We did modeling for a variety of hedge funds on the peg of the real, and it's worked. So I was a bit skeptical of this thing at first, but it actually has proven accurate so far. And we're using it now, right, on whether OPEC Plus will hold, whether the Russian and the Saudi cooperation will hold. That's something I think we can model, and we are modeling, and I think that will hold.
Well, the algorithm is unambiguous in that regard. I mean, there's a greater than 70% likelihood that, according to our predictive analytic models, that Russia and Saudi Arabia will continue to cooperate on oil production and pricing through production restraints like this latest agreement to cut by 2.5 million barrels per day each for at least through the medium term and quite possibly long term.
So what I was prefacing my answer by saying that we do have an analytical model that we do use, and it has proven correct in the past. However, I'm going to be sort of like in the movie Star Wars and just go let the Force be with me and not forget about the analytics. And the way I look at it, without the big mathematical model, is that people have a choice. Rather like they did at the time of the Depression and the Second World War. You can decide that this whole collapse is the fault of the president, and that blaming Herbert Hoover for the recession or the Depression, which perhaps he did blame, should have some of the blame. I'm not saying he shouldn't or not, but I'm saying whether you blamed him for that and you got rid of Herbert Hoover and elected Franklin Roosevelt because you saw him as the cause of your problems. On the other hand, you could have a situation like you did during the Second World War, where nobody really blamed Franklin Roosevelt, I don't think, for starting the Second World War. But what they saw was that they were in the midst of a crisis, and whether they liked Franklin Roosevelt or not, it was, and his economic policies, it was probably not a good idea to change the horse or in the middle of the river. So they continued to elect him. So I think that's the situation you have now, whether people are going to say this whole thing is Trump's fault, or they're going to say Trump is likely to lead us out of this. And at least he's doing that now, and we should stick with the guy we know. So I think that's the situation you have. If my own gut feeling is that more people are going to say that, this is a guy who the economy was doing well before we crashed, and it will probably he can help us get out of it rather than somebody we don't know. So anyway, that's my thinking, and that seems to be what our model says as well.
Okay, we have a question from Keith Huffman. Like I said, I'm reading all the questions and they're excellent, so keep them coming, and they are very interesting. Keith asks us, as a U.S. national interest, should action take place that there's less imports of Saudi oil, and if so, is that possible? Maybe in your discussion, you can also explain a bit to our attendees and to our wider audience the whole issue of grades of oil. Why is it that U.S. refineries are still importing foreign oil? Even though there's a much cheaper oil available, homegrown oil. So, Mike, would you like to start with that?
I'll be brief because David knows more about this particular area than I do, but I would just make the observation that most of our transportation and much of our heavy industry runs on diesel, not on gasoline. And the production of diesel requires heavier grades of oil, which are in shorter supply in the United States than they are elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons we have to continue to import oil, even as we become the largest producer in the world in recent years and a major exporter.
David?
Yeah, I think that there is again, it's perhaps a media spin of something, but the idea of energy independence is something of a figment of somebody's imagination. America is intertwined in a global economy, and nowhere more so than in oil. Oil is sold and traded on a global market. So unless we wanted to completely shut off ourselves from the rest of the world, the price of oil in the rest of the world is going to affect the price of oil in the United States. So we're not independent. We may be independent in the physical movement of oil, but unless you're going to tell people in Texas that you cannot export oil or you cannot import oil, the price of oil that's set in wherever, in Rotterdam or wherever, is going to affect the United States. So we're not really independent. Mike said exactly rightly. I mean, yes, you can look at these things and you can say that America became an oil exporter. If you add up LNG and all grades of oil, that's true. But we still do, as Mike said, we import certain grades of oil, and the Saudis produce, just to answer your question, the Saudis produce 5 grades of oil. These are based on how heavy the oil is. That is to say, how much, basically how much carbon there is in the oil, and also the sulfur content. So you can have it sweet or sour, heavy or light.
And that's always an exam question in my Georgetown class on energy. So you've just given them the grades.
They just got the grades. So, and basically lighter grades, you can, there are some grades that are in Saudi Arabia that are so light that you could actually put it in your car and drive it away. And there are others that, you could pave the road with because it's almost like asphalt. And that's the whole purpose of what a refinery does is to split these different grades out. So, answer your question is we don't really, again, to be specific, we do not import a great deal of Saudi oil at the moment. The big market for Saudi Arabia is China. So if you want to know how the Saudi economy is going to do, look at the Chinese economy. They export very little oil to the United States. I think last time I looked, like 500,000 barrels a day, not much. The other point to remember about Saudi oil coming to the United States is that the Saudis, Aramco is trying to become like an international oil company, like the other IOCs. So it wants to not just sell oil, it wants to have petrochemical factories, and it wants to have refineries, and it wants to have markets. So you may not know this, but the largest oil refinery in the United States belongs to the Saudis. And they did that specifically because that oil refinery, guess what? Imports Saudi oil. So that will continue. I mean, they bought that refinery. It's in Texas, and they use it to bring their own oil into the United States. So
you mentioned this issue of energy independence. There hasn't been in the last, I believe, 50 years a U.S. president, whether Democrat or Republican, that hasn't in State of the Nation and in the election speeches, mentioned energy independence, even though what we really want is energy security, right? We want to, but you can't imagine any other field. For instance, would we ever want food independence, technology independence? Why would we want to cut off markets when they actually give us more options than than being an energy island? But it's always a part of the U.S. national political rhetoric. We have a few really excellent questions on Russia, so I'm going to ask Michael to open up on these as our Russia man here. Michael? Can you talk about both within the decision-making structure in Russia, shifting between the president and the prime minister, or the oil companies themselves? How do you see them impacting these various decisions on the cuts, and how obedient are different fractions in Russia to the decisions made by the president, and how do you see these domestic elements affecting Russia's next moves?
It's a great question. In net terms, and this is a bit of oversimplification, but in net terms, the domestic Russian oil lobby is reluctant to cut production. They would rather take market share. At the same time, Putin can make a very strong argument that cooperation with Saudi Arabia has been profitable. Oil profits amount to 35 to 40% of the Russian state budget on the federal level on a given year, depending on prices and what the budget's doing. So at the end of the day, it's very much a constant interchange between the political level on the one hand and the oil lobby on the other. I mentioned already that Igor Sechin, the head of Rosneft, the largest parastatal oil company in Russia, has been upset with one result of the cooperation between Moscow and Riyadh, which he sees as a gradual cession of market share on Russia's part to Washington, to the U.S. oil industry in the Permian and elsewhere. He's right about that. Every time the Russians restrain production along with Riyadh, the U.S. industry is happy to produce more at a higher price that would pertain otherwise. But it's hard to see what else the Russians and the Saudis can do now that the U.S. has emerged as a major producer again. So, frankly, the best the Russians can do is to try and expand their overall hydrocarbon production. They've been expanding production of natural gas exports. They do 243 roughly billion cubic meters of pipeline exports annually. And last year they did 24 billion cubic meters of LNG exports, mostly to Western Europe. So that's a big play for them. One of the great structural failures of Putin's administration of Russia has been the failure to, just like in Saudi Arabia until recently, the failure to imagine an economic future for Russia in which oil and gas exports were not the primary source of hard currency receipts. Last year, Russia ran $179 billion goods and services trade surplus. We had a $616 billion, of course, deficit in this country, so we can only dream of surpluses such as the Russians are getting on a much smaller base. But $121 billion of that came from the oil and gas sector. So one of the things the Russians need to do is diversify away from oil and gas in much the same way that Saudi Arabia does. They face much the same challenge. They're better positioned than the Saudis to address that challenge because, unlike Riyadh, they already have several highly developed non-oil industries. They're the largest producer of nuclear reactors in the world and the largest exporter through Rosatom. And of course, they're the second largest arms exporter in the United States, after the United States, that is to say. They earned $11 billion on arms exports last year at a minimum. I haven't seen final figures for that yet. So at the end of the day, they've got potential. They could expand their production of electronics, of aviation gear and equipment and aircraft, stuff related to the atomic power industry. There's a number of areas where they could expand. One of the big areas where they've expanded recently, and this was as a direct result of European Union and U.S. sanctions imposed after the seizure of Crimea back in 2014, was agriculture. Russia is now, for the first time since 1913, the largest exporter of grain in the world, in particular wheat. They displaced us back in 2015 and have stayed ahead ever since then. And this has led to big geopolitical shifts. It used to be that one of the big holds we had over Egypt in the context of Camp David the Camp David Peace Accord was the fact that we supplied almost all of Egypt's wheat imports. Egypt, as you know, can't feed itself and imports huge amounts of grain. Russia has now taken over 100% of the Egyptian wheat market. It's just one example of the flexibility the Russians can display, which they're normally not given credit for. So I would expect that one of the results of the current crisis would be a further diversification of the Russian economy away from dependence on oil.
Interesting. Unfortunately, our hour is up. This has been a great discussion. I think we've been lucky to hear from two panelists that have both global theoretical understanding, but also rich regional, country-specific, both details and the overview. I really learned a lot here and found it fascinating. So I want to thank both of you and thank the Gulf International Forum for hosting us and for initiating this event. And I hope we'll be discussing the oil market together for many times over this year. I think there'll be a lot of volatility and a lot of developments that will spur our discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.